Last summer, Mrs. Thatcher launched the Battersea, a project to transform the power station into a palace of entertainment for London. This week, a new campaign has been launched to save Battersea, now facing the winter gutted and open to the elements. Has the Battersea dream been shattered? The Wandsworth skyline has been dominated by the stark outline of Battersea Power Station since the 1930s. It's captured the imaginations of generations of Londoners. It was once a temple of power. When it stopped generating electricity in 1983, it had become a mausoleum of outmoded technology. Unless someone could make money out of Europe's biggest brick building, its days were numbered. But onto the stage strode John Lawson Broome, mastermind behind Alton Towers, with a vision of saving Battersea by turning it into a colossal pleasure palace. And his most enthusiastic supporter was Margaret Thatcher herself. For her, he was the living embodiment of Thatcherism, proving that private enterprise would be a worthy custodian of the nation's heritage.
I am very, very happy to be associated with this. Because when we had got all the financial things right, when we had got all of the general laws right, trade union reform and so on, just wanted to get a quick look in. My worry was that there might not be sufficient people of enterprise to take advantage of it. We know today there are. This will be the biggest project in Europe.
John Broome promised Margaret Thatcher that if she returned to Battersea on May the 21st, 1990, it would open at 2:30 p.m. precisely. Get there at 2:34, he claimed, and you'd be too late. Margaret Thatcher was quoted as saying, "This is a wonderful example of private enterprise and local government working hand in hand. John Broome and Wandsworth Council are to be congratulated." For Tory Wandsworth Council, it was to be a grand political coup, bringing jobs and prosperity back to Battersea, just in time for the local elections in May 1990. Just 7 months from that deadline, Battersea Power Station lies gutted and empty. The cranes are still, the workers have been sent home. And John Broome, whose plans and projects for the site have been all over the newspapers for the past 5 years, now refuses to talk about it. Tonight, the London programme reveals why John Broome can no longer fulfil his promise to Margaret Thatcher. Cult status hit Battersea in the 1970s, when Pink Floyd flew a pig above its gleaming towers. The pig, designed by Roger Waters for the Animals album, was said to symbolise the fans, and the 4 phallic chimneys the monolithic rock group. Londoners might be less pretentious, but they're just as passionate about the power station.
It's just stunning, it's so impressive, the scale of it, it's really vast, it's wonderful.
But I can see it out of my window, and we can always tell whether it's going to be foggy or not if we don't see the chimneys.
Well, I used to live in Battersea for 3 years now. I used to like watching the smoke come out of the chimney pots, watching them paint it up. It's sort of part of London.
It's a part of Battersea, isn't it? It's Battersea heritage. So therefore it should stay as it is.
And for those who worked there, Battersea is still as big a part of their lives as ever.
Just like something's been cut out of your life, really. Honestly, it's just, I mean, I drive past there now on the other side 2 or 3 times a week, and every time I drive past, I give it a salute. Honestly, I do. I do. Yeah, they may laugh, but this is the way you feel about a place, you know.
Local mural artist Brian Barnes has taken much of his inspiration from the power station.
I suppose Battersea is famous for 2 things. One is the Dogs Home, Battersea Dogs Home, and the other is the power station. And I think the power station is a much better image. It's It's got a really interesting history about it. And I've lived with it for 25 years as an image on my horizon, and I really like the building. I nearly said I love it. I suppose I do love it in a way.
The prospect of demolition first raised its head 10 years ago when the CEGB announced Battersea was to close. Public outcry forced Michael Heseltine, then Minister for the Environment, to list the building. But this was just the beginning of Battersea's problems.
Listing a building is a recognition of its architectural and historical importance. And, of course, it means that every step should be taken to preserve it, though it doesn't mean that a building will be preserved. In this country, listing does not bring with it automatic financial support, as it does in some countries. And clearly you therefore have to find a viable economic use for a building.
Michael Heseltine had prevented its immediate destruction. But it was the Electricity Board, owners of the site, who would have to find the estimated £20 million it would cost to preserve it. For them, listing was a disaster. It turned Battersea from a potential gold mine into a millstone round their necks. The board decided to hold a competition to get rid of the building one way or another. If there had been no clear winner, it would have provided the CEGB with the evidence they needed to apply for delisting and demolition of the building. But however cynical the motives behind the competition might have been, it inspired those who loved the building. One of these was Peter Kramer, a freelance engineer who planned to use Battersea to solve London's rubbish problems.
Well, 3 tons of rubbish is equal to 1 ton of coal, and London generates something like 3 million tons of domestic rubbish every year. At the moment, that stuff is hauled out to places like Swindon, Didcot, Maidstone, and up into Bedfordshire. It seemed to me to be logical to keep it all here and turn its fuel content into something useful, namely energy. And that activity could be totally enclosed in Battersea Power Station so that no one would see it or hear it or smell it.
Local resident architect Mark Leslie was first to think of the idea of a theme park, long before John Broome came on the scene.
I was a resident of Battersea, living in Prince of Wales Drive, virtually overlooking the power station. Every weekend I used to jog round the park in the mornings, and literally hundreds of people would accost me saying, "Where's the funfair?" Because in the public mind, the funfair had never gone. So, knowing that the power station was coming to the end of its useful life, I saw it looming up and I said, "There's the funfair."
Just as Disney found inspiration in Hollywood, Mark Leslie says he found his inspiration in Britain's unique historical past.
My specific idea was to have a sort of participatory themed museum as a monument to the Britain as the original powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution.
Inspired by Leslie's ideas for a great British progress park as a homage to Britain's industrial past, developer David Roach put together a consortium to enter the scheme for the CEGB's competition. A late addition to the consortium was John Broome, brought in for his theme park experience. But he soon took over, and it was his plans, not Leslie's, that won the competition. Journalist Mirabar Hillel is a long-time Battersea watcher. She heard the full story from David Roach.
Well, formally and officially, the competition was won fair and square by the Sir David Roach Consortium. If you watch television, listen to radio, saw the newspapers, you would get a distinct impression that the competition was won by John Broome of Alton Towers. And this was engineered by John Broome. When I asked Sir David Roach about it, all he would say was, "I put together the winning consortium, I needed an operator for the leisure centre, and boy, did I get an operator."
By the time of the press conference to launch the winner of the competition, John Broome was firmly in charge.
It will substantially, of the 6,000 jobs proposed, a very substantial proportion will be from this area, and that's no mean situation in its own right. But other than that, it will tend, or in fact more than tend, to uplift the area and the prosperity of the area and all the environment and infrastructure with such a major scheme as this.
As winner, John Broome was able to buy the Battersea site at a knockdown price of £1.5 million, a tenth of what the CEGB could have got for it without the power station. On the other hand, the CEGB could wash its hands of its responsibility, while for Wandsworth, Broome held out the tantalising hope of regeneration for a blighted inner-city area.
It was important to make sure that we restored the site, restored the building, provided jobs on what was potentially a derelict site, and John Broome was the only chance, the only hope.
In 1984, when Broome won the competition, his scheme was going to cost £34 million and take 2 years to complete. But it took until 1986 to buy land from British Rail needed for parking and win planning permission from Wandsworth. The cost had risen to over £50 million. It was another year before the CEGB stripped out the asbestos and Broome actually took over the site. The cost now had nearly tripled to £135 million. But it wasn't until December 1987 that financing was secured, allowing work to begin. And by February 1988, the cost had hit £170 million and was still rising. But despite the obvious problems, Broome's credibility went from strength to strength.
What sort of training are you doing?
I can't say that because I go away again.
Visits by the royal family to Alton Towers put the country's seal of approval on his endeavours. In the mid-1980s, the leisure business was one of Britain's growth industries. John Broome's Alton Towers was one of its most spectacular successes. Broome, the golden boy, pulled off the PR coup of getting Margaret Thatcher to give her seal of approval to the Battersea. She was just the icing on the cake for one of the most spectacular PR launches the capital has seen.
The Alton Group presents the Battersea. John Broome, CBE, says, "It fills me with pride to know I'm taking on something so wonderful, so colossal, so unique." The Battersea will be a palace of entertainment with 7 floors of enjoyment on a 31-acre riverside site. This colossal pleasure palace is expected to be the jewel in London's pleasure industry crown. The Battersea will be themed on the 5 continents of the world. Visitors will have the choice of over 200 rides, shows and exhibitions, a massive ice rink, as well as restaurants, shops and conference facilities. The Battersea will have its own front door at Victoria Station at the hub of the public transport system. Platform 1 will be refurbished to provide the gateway for the new development. Glass curtain walls will reveal the interior of the station so that entry and exit of the bullet trains will be seen by as many people as possible. All the carriages will be darkened, with the windows blacked out, to create the sensation of travelling at over 150 miles per hour.
Broome had a team of up to 40 designers working full-time on the project. By January this year, they had a scale model of one of the main attractions, the talking tree. This was only 2 months before work stopped, but John Broome was still exuding confidence.
We have a laid-back, mature, effective management here that hits it right first time, strikes the button, makes no major mistakes, and gets on with the job. So instead of having all these enormous stop-go situations, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're quietly getting on with the job and building here the biggest and the greatest entertainment complex that's being built at the present time in the world.
When work stopped on March the 16th, John Broome said there was to be a short pause for refinancing the second stage of the project. In other words, he'd run out of money. But Broome had reported confidently to Wandsworth that he'd secured £170 million worth of finance through the Security Pacific Bank and Brokers Hall Gazette. So why wasn't this enough? This is Companies House, which holds financial information on all UK firms. We've come here to look through the accounts of Alton and Battersea to try to find out what they will tell us about the financing of the Battersea project. And here we are, Alton and Battersea. The information in these envelopes should provide at least part of the explanation as to why work on the Battersea stopped in March and when it's likely to start again. International accounting expert Dr. Peter Walton explained to us why the project was in difficulties.
Here is what is presumably a long-term development, which is going to run for several years, spending money before any money comes in through the turnstiles, as it were, that It's a project, therefore, that will require finance for a number of years. And if we look at the accounts, we can see that the finance that's available has only been granted for a short term. It's been granted for less than a year.
Not only that, but in the financial year ending November 1988, Broome had access to just under £35 million, not nearly enough to complete the Battersea project. Furthermore, his auditors qualified the accounts, with serious implications for the whole of the Alton Group.
It's relatively unusual for a company to have a qualification on the audit report. Most companies would try and avoid that. In this case, it means that the auditors have doubt whether the company is going to stay in business or whether it's going to go out of business. Alton Towers has given guarantees for the financing in Battersea. The consequence of that is that if the banks withdrew finance from Battersea, they could very well turn around to Alton Towers, and Alton Towers would then be at risk.
Victoria, could you tell me
So how is it that Broome, the star entrepreneur, has got himself into such deep water? We talked to London's biggest property consultant, Savills of Piccadilly.
Leisure in general is an untried and untested market, and therefore there are not the investors available which there are in the more accepted forms of property development, such as office or industrial or retail. I think one of the problems with a leisure development is that there can't be a phasing of it. It's an all-or-nothing development. Large sites are very often phased by developers to release income and capital to fund the future phases.
In May this year, Broome announced new funding and a partnership with major international property dealer Paul Bloomfield. It looked like a significant change of direction for the Battersea project. In a press release, Broome announced
each of these partners will have a 50% stake in the new company to be called Alton International Limited. The company has purchased the Battersea Wharf site adjacent to the power station, increasing the total area from 32 to 40 acres of Thameside freehold in London.
Why have Broome and Bloomfield added the Battersea Wharf site to the development? The property experts say there are very good reasons, most of all persuading the banks to invest.
The advantage about the Battersea Wharf site is it enables a phased development to take place on the entire site, and money released from the phasing will fund the leisure facilities which investors may be concerned about the viability of at the moment.
By bracketing the high-risk leisure scheme with a lower-risk office and residential development, they have a much better chance of attracting the investors they need. The only problem is Broome and Bloomfield don't own the site. A company called Park Securities does, and it has its own plans.
The Battersea Wharf was bought by Park in 1988. It still is owned by us, always has been owned by us. And earlier in '89, we had discussions with a company called ICA, which at that time was Paul Bloomfield. Those discussions never came to fruition, and then I think ICA became part of Alton International, but at no time have we ever had any negotiations with John Broome whatsoever.
When we came back to Companies House, we also discovered that Alton International isn't here. At least not in the form that John Broome described. The Alton International listed here is actually based in Alton, in Hampshire. We followed the trail down to Alton. Alton International vans are a familiar sight down here, and we soon tracked down Mr. McGinty, chairman and managing director.
Well, I started with Alton Transport, and we had that doing household removals. And we've been successful with that. And then I wanted to get away from the transport in the yellow pages. You know, people were thinking, oh, it's transport, so they weren't ringing us. So I then decided to go Alton International, because by that time we were running to Germany, France, Spain, well, not Spain, but France and Italy, and Ireland, and it was international and something I wanted to do.
Mr. McGinty was very surprised to find someone else using his company name.
My accountant, Julian Shepherd from Winchester, telephoned me to say that a French company involved in the amusement business had offered to buy shares in Alton International Limited, and asked me what the hell I was doing, as he didn't know anything about it. Quite frankly, I didn't know anything about it either.
The name Alton International has now quietly been dropped. Since the announcement of their joint venture in May, there seems to have been some disagreement between Broome and Bloomfield about their plans. On September the 10th, 1989, the Sunday Times said, Paul Bloomfield, the millionaire property trader, is poised to unveil plans for a huge £750 million office and leisure development. But the redevelopment proposal spells an end to plans that the former Battersea Power Station would be turned into a £280 million theme park, as originally envisaged by John Broome. But John Broome hit back the next day with a press release which stated,
"The Battersea scheme will remain dominated by the leisure park concept, much of which will be inside the power station, as has always been the case."
A few hours later, the same press release was reissued. This time it was signed by Bloomfield as well as Broome.
So here we are, and...
But the very next day, Wandsworth councillors found themselves scrutinising a new planning application and wondering where the Battersea theme park had gone.
And I looked at it, and frankly, it was the kind of planning application which we would have rejected if someone was applying for a back extension with. It had been drawn by a computer on the back of an envelope, but there were these kind of quick outline drawings which didn't indicate what things were, where they went, and in fact in the first planning application it didn't even say what was happening in the power station building itself.
Little by little, more information has come in on the new planning application. But the future of the power station is still uncertain. And John Broome, the man who could explain what's happening, has refused to answer our letters, take our telephone calls, or make any comment whatsoever on his plans for the future of London's most distinctive listed building. We may not have been able to see Mr. Broome, but what we can say is that if his last planning application is anything to go by, it may well take him at least 2 years to get another acceptable planning permission through. There are rumours that he's arranged a new funding package for the project, but of course we've heard those rumours many times before. In the meantime, the real casualty is Battersea Power Station itself.
I do think it's a tremendous scandal that a listed building, and one of the great buildings of the interwar years, should have been allowed to get into this condition. It's up to Wandsworth Council, of course, to do something about this. It's their immediate responsibility, but clearly with a building of this scale, English heritage must have a role to play, and I would like to see them doing the maximum to make sure this great London monument is preserved.
But those who could step in while Broome does nothing seem reluctant to use the considerable powers they have to safeguard listed buildings.
It's a big building, it's a difficult building. There is still a prospect, I don't know how good, but a prospect of the original scheme picking up, and if that happens, then that is the best option. I can't think it would help it greatly for English Heritage or the London Borough Council to acquire a building in that state.
The thing is not rotting away, and both English Heritage and the engineers have looked at that building very carefully. A small amount of money needs to be spent to ensure it's protected in its present situation against the weather. The plans for this have been put to the Alton Board, and we wait their response.
When Wandsworth Council is written about in newspapers, it is described as the jewel in Margaret Thatcher's crown. And in my view, for the leadership of the Conservatives here in Wandsworth, it is more important to back up the Prime Minister and to support her than it is to represent local residents. The Prime Minister had personally put her mark on this scheme, and therefore they have continued to back the scheme, back Broome, support it, beyond anything that's reasonable in terms of the interests of local residents.
Local residents feel the time has come to act. Ernest Rodker and Brian Barnes have started a campaign to save the power station. They believe that as time goes on, the arguments for demolition will get stronger and stronger.
Well, we've waited and waited to see one of the authorities actually take a grip of the situation and do something. And we don't believe we can wait any longer, because this will be the second winter that the power station has been without a roof and without a west wall. 10 years on, we've got to start the whole thing again and make the authorities responsible, English Heritage, Battersea, Wandsworth Council and the Department of Environment actually respond to the legislation that is there to protect buildings like this. And if we don't, then it will be an absolute scandal.